Now, when it comes to these deductive arguments, of course, the real question is whether the premises themselves are true, and that's where all the activity is being spent. But it seems to me the only way you can say there can be no proofs for God's existence is if you deviate from the ordinary logician's, philosopher's definition of what a proof is. And this, I think, is where Dennis has made his mistake. This is just what he's done. And to kind of isolate his own argument here, to prove something, you must measure it by the senses, is what he's saying. God is not physical. He's not available to the senses. Therefore, you cannot prove God. Now, there is a logical argument. That argument itself is a proof. It's a deductive proof. And it seems to me that if the premises are true, given that it's valid, that is, the conclusion follows from the premises, well, then you've got a good argument here. But I don't think the premises are true because to prove something does not mean that you have to measure it by the senses. I think this is an odd characterization of proof. For one, probably, this would be a surprise to Thomas Aquinas, wouldn't it? He's arguably the smartest guy that ever lived, apart from Jesus. Okay, and Jesus kind of had a leg up because he was God. That kind of helps. But apart from Jesus, Aquinas was really, really, really smart. In fact, right around 1200 AD, this guy puts forth proofs for the existence of God. Now, I understand that there are people who don't think that those proofs go through. These deductive syllogistic arguments actually accomplish what he thinks they accomplish. But they're called proofs because they are those things. They're attempts to prove, and they're using a certain deductive methodology. Now, even if the proofs don't go through, as far as I can tell, no one has ever accused him of impropriety. That since God was finite, that since God wasn't a finite material being, that therefore it's just a waste of time to offer proofs. Nobody said that because in their understanding, there was no reason that you couldn't reason like that about God. Now, again, there is some debate about whether his proofs work, but they aren't faulted because God is not a material being and God is not finite. I actually think that Dennis's definition of proving something here is actually driven by a modernist impulse that the only things you can actually know, and here we're using know and prove kind of as synonyms, are those things that are known through science, which employs this empirical method that he's talking about. So science is what gives us truth about the world, and those are the only way you can have proofs of things. And that's why Dennis uses the language that he did about measuring or things you can see and hear, and the senses are involved. Now, here's the problem with that, and this is it's a bit surprising to me because a lot of people may not realize this, and apparently Dennis didn't, but the irony is that science does not operate on a deductive method of proof. It operates on an inductive method of probability. So science by nature is never meant to prove anything. And if you talk to people in the philosophy of science, certainly, and people who are doing the work of science, they're going to tell you, well, you know what, we're always tentative about, or at least in principle, we're always tentative about our conclusions because of the nature of inductive reasoning. You reason from a body of evidence to a general rule that probably covers all the particulars. But you can never know for sure that it does cover all the particulars. That's a liability of inductive reasoning. So you go out and you want to find out what are crows like. Well, let's look at a bunch of them. There's a crow, there's a crow, there's a crow. What, 2 legs, 2 wings, black. All right, so you draw from the group the general conclusion that crows have 2 legs and 2 wings and are black birds. But you realize, since you haven't seen every single crow in existence, that it may be that some crow might deviate from this, and so you make a generalization. It isn't a proof. And indeed, these kinds of proofs that are based on, and I'm putting scare quotes here around the word proof, that are based on scientific evidence have been disproved countless times. That is, scientists understood things to be one way at one point and another way at another point. They were wrong. Now, this isn't the liability of science. It is the nature of science. I'm not saying this so that you mistrust the deliverances of science. I'm saying this so that you understand properly how the empirical method works. Where Dennis is suggesting that the only kind of thing you can prove are physical things based on the physical senses, I'm saying that these are the only kind of things you can't prove in any final sense, and science is never intended to do this. And this is why science, in principle at least, is never absolute. And I say in principle because obviously scientists deliver absolute judgments about things like Darwinian evolution. But in principle, to be fair for them, that's not the way it's supposed to work. It's never absolute. It's always somewhat tentative, theoretically. Now, here's the danger of Dennis's approach, and I'll close with this thought. From my perspective, it's that people associate the word proof with knowledge. And if you can prove it, then it can be known. If you cannot prove it, then it can't be known. Instead, it's simply an article of faith. And at this point, we mean leap of faith. And so it's what Dennis is saying, and I know I've heard him at other times make this point, that if you have scientific evidence, empirical evidence, then you've got knowledge. And if you got knowledge, then there's no room for faith. But you can't have knowledge for spiritual things because there's no scientific evidence for those things. He would say there's no proof. And so instead there is this, I don't know if he'd use the word leap, but certainly there is this faith. Faith as opposed to knowledge, opposite from knowledge, at opposite ends of the spectrum. I think this is a big mistake. If you know anything about how knowledge works, and what the Bible teaches on this thing, these things aren't at opposite ends of the spectrum. They go together. Look in the Exodus account. 10 times during the Exodus account, God worked these miracles, it says there, so that the people would know that God was God. Know was the word. So that they should know. The book of Jeremiah has this like 78 times, the same characterization, so that they will know. The New Testament, the same thing. And it is this knowledge based on evidence that then people are enjoined to act upon, and that's what the Bible calls faith, an act of trust. It isn't a leap of faith, it's a step of intelligent trust. And, what matters to me is that you understand this. I mean, I think there's so much confusion about the concept of what proof actually is. Throw the word out, don't even use it. What matters is whether or not you have arguments that are compelling and persuasive. And if you've given evidence for which the existence of God is the most reasonable inference, you've done your job. It's an inference to the best explanation. So my point is, there is no good reason to think you cannot have knowledge about God if the evidence is good. The Bible teaches this, both the Old and the New Testaments, and our common experience of knowing things teaches us this too. And this is why, by the way, Psalm 14 says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." Now, how could God say this if the evidence was not overwhelming, such that anyone who does not believe is a fool? Now, there's no leap of faith necessary to believe in God, only an intelligent step of trust, based on abundant evidence. And arguments that demonstrate this are available and they are compelling, and I think could be called proofs, especially ones that are deductive in form. And these kinds of arguments have changed many people's thinking for a long time.